Welcome back to KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. The show is made possible by the McPherson Group Tax Defense Attorneys, BeatIRS.com, rescuing Americans from IRS tyranny. We have Walid Shoebat on the line, and the link may be a little tenuous. We had some phone problems the last segment and may be still having a few now. Walid, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine and dandy.
Fantastic. Well, we're on live and we're honored to have you on the show. Talk to our listeners last segment a little bit about your background that is from your website, Shoebat.com. Very excited to hear about your perspectives of what's going on in the Middle East. But first, could you tell our audience a little bit about where you are today compared to where you were at when you lived back in the Middle East?
Well, I like to compare myself with, if you watch the movie Star Trek, with Captain Spock. In other words, I kind of was born of the alien world, lived with the alien world. My mother married my father, who was a Muslim, an Islamist. She visited the Middle East, Bethlehem, where the birthplace of Christ was, and she didn't realize that in the Muslim world, once you marry a Muslim, you're technically a Muslim, and the children are Muslims. And so she couldn't leave her country. She was held against her will for 35-some years, in which I grew up, of course, in the education system, the mosques, going to the Temple Mount area called Masjid al-Aqsa there, listening to sermons by Ikrimah Sabri, whose predecessor was Hajj Amin al-Husseini. There's history there. There's a history of Islam permeating the Middle East from the inception of the Muslim Brotherhood, permeating from Hizb ut-Tahrir of Palestine, which is an Islamist movement which basically began to inculcate itself all throughout the West in UK, from the UK to the Indian subcontinent, and so on and so forth. So it was a migratory path, if you will. When I became 18, I came to the States and was involved in the Muslim Brotherhood after I was disenfranchised with nationalism, because the PLO, as I was a member of, I was a terrorist, it was not consolidating all the Islamic efforts that will unite non-Arabic speaking entities together. So there was an aspiration of Islam, Khilafah, or the Caliphate. And that was in the early 80s. I was in Chicago. And later on in my life, of course, I got married. And my wife, she was Catholic, and I wanted to convert her to Islam, as is the duty of every Muslim male who marries a non-Muslim. And in the process, she's challenged me to show her the problems in the Bible, in the biblical narrative. I purchased the Bible, began to read it from beginning to end, and was very touched by the message of Scripture, in which I no longer have to sacrifice my life or my son's life for the cause of Allah, the Caliphate, and the Islamic Revolution, and that Christ gave his son to die on my behalf. And that was a message that I began to understand. I mean, I heard the message of the gospel before, but I never saw it firsthand when I read the Scripture. I heard gospel message from American evangelicals, they spoke in tongues. I made fun of them. It just didn't square with me. But when I read Scriptures, I began to find out the elements of the prophetic elements, eschatological elements in Scripture, in which you find many nations mentioned regarding the second coming of Christ, in which you find Christ in every battle, whether it's in Isaiah 19, he combats Egypt, Islamic country. In Isaiah 63, in Isaiah chapter 10, he combats Lebanon. In Habakkuk 3, he combats Arabia, Midian, the brother of Ishmael. It just amazed me how the biblical narrative was able to paint the scenario of Christ's coming. It's not just the bloodshed of Christ. It's not just the redemptive act, but the historical, references in Scripture regarding Israel, its right to the land, the issue historically, archaeologically, in every way, that the connection to all civilization came from Israel. And this is why we have a Christian civilization. And so I began to, yes.
That's kind of an unusual approach to take as a Palestinian actually looking toward Israel as being the birthplace. You don't hear that very often, do you? I was in Israel a couple of times over the last 4 or 5 years, and it's interesting because most of the Palestinians that I interacted with, of course, even the Christian Palestinians, didn't have that kind of a perspective. There were a couple of exceptions to that, of course. Do you still interact with your relatives from Palestine or from Israel that are still there?
Well, this is the part that most Americans don't get. Islam is kind of like the Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave unless you go in a coffin. And so not only you lose your family, you get threats from your family. I lost all my property. I haven't talked to my brother in 15 years. And I haven't talked to my family, my father, everything separate completely. They said if you want your property back, you have to come back to the Sharia court in Bethlehem. And you have to declare the Shahadatan, which means I must say there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger, or else I will lose my property.
And it's kind of amazing. I mean, Bethlehem used to be a majority Christian town. When we were there 2 years ago, I mean, it's hardly any Christian Palestinians that we could see. We went to the Church of the Nativity. Actually, high animosity compared to the last time that we were in Israel from Arabs toward or Palestinians toward Americans. I was really shocked at the change in attitudes.
Well, it tells us something. It tells us that the Islamification process is taking place all over. We see the same thing happening in Iraq. So the Islamification process is not just the idea of making it difficult for Christians, like you see in the Palestinian arena, where Palestinians will confiscate Christian lands, make claims, false claims, go to the court, say there's two witnesses who are Muslim, the court is Sharia court, it's Sharia-driven, you lose your property, you have nothing left, so you migrate to Chile, to the United States. But now it's really transforming into something more. In other words, tyranny begins at that stage in which tyranny wants to basically bring in homosexual rights. Pretty soon it will be rights to cannibalism, rights to polygamy, and that's how tyrannies work. It's not just Islamo tyranny, but any tyranny. This is how it works. And this is why we have to appreciate Christian civilization that came from the Middle East. And you see the same thing happening with Syrian Christians, the Coptic Christians in Egypt. And so it is a war on Christianity. We have to understand that. It's not just a war on, let's say, dictatorships. This is the misconception of the West in the Arab Spring. They're thinking that the Egyptians wanted all of a sudden freedom, democracy. And I remember going on Fox News. I said, this is going to be an Islamic winter. And I was basically chewed out by David Asman and Fox News because I didn't sound right. And the problem of the misconception doesn't stem only from the liberal agenda, but it stems also from the right wing or the conservative agenda in misunderstanding the Middle East. It is a war between secularism, between nationalistic aspiration. Because you look at Sisi of Egypt, he's a nationalist. You look at Syria, Bashar al-Assad, he's a nationalist. Don't touch these. This is a bad idea because what replaces nationalism in the Middle East is Islamofascism. Whether you call it the Free Syrian Army, it transforms to Hizb al-Shamal or al-Nusra. It becomes all of a sudden Al-Qaeda, then ISIS, and it just basically migrates from sort of like the La Victoria salsa, from mild to hot to hotter to habanero.
And just so our listeners are clear on this, I mean, the Free Syrian Army is an entity that the United States is purportedly supporting, right?
Correct. And this is what we see Obama doing currently with the government of Turkey. They're training the United States. And if you look at all the media that you see, you watch the newspaper information, it's all really misconception. They say that the U.S. President Obama really is hesitant about training the FSA. And I can quote you the New York Times, the Guardian, the BBC. And then you find in the same newspapers the reverse, that they've already trained FSA. They've been training them since 2 years ago. And so, because the idea by the U.S. is we got to oust Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad is an ally of Iran. The war is on Iran. They don't understand is that every time you have a war with any entity in the Middle East, you create a vacuum. If you defeat Iran, you create a vacuum. If you defeat even ISIS now ISIS has become an entity. If you defeat it, you create another vacuum. because they have a minor caliphate. Tomorrow there'll be a grand caliphate. Because you look at someone like Erdogan, he wants to be the sultan of the Muslim world.
All right, you're talking about the president of Turkey, right?
Correct. The president of Turkey has Ottoman aspiration. In fact, I've been writing about the Ottoman aspirations of Turkey for 2 decades. I remember the days when people used to laugh at me. They say, "What are you talking about?" Turkey, you could see them, they're friends with Israel. I remember Shimon Peres saying, the prime example of democracy in the Muslim world is Turkey. And I was laughing. He doesn't understand Islam. It's not just the Americans, but the Israelis also don't get it, because you come from a Judeo-Christian perspective and you think that this is an apple pie, and the Jew thinks it's a gefilte fish, and it's not. Right. It has a different concept.
And let's talk more about that after this break, focusing on Turkey, its role, and how you think it may end up actually carrying out, as you put it, the Grand Caliphate. More with Walid Shoebat after this. Stay with us. Welcome back to KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM, The Joe Miller Show. Walid Shoebat with us, former Palestinian terrorist PLO member, converted to Christ, now active and involved in sounding the alarm about Islamofascism, the growth of the global caliphate. And Walid, you've also written a book. Why don't you tell, we just had a call from a listener who wondered if you had co-authored a book with Jerry Boykin. What is the book that you've written?
No, I've written God's War on Terror, Islam, Prophecy, and the Bible. That's mostly a biblical concept of prophecy, understanding it from a Middle Eastern perspective, and as well as the case for Islamophobia.
Okay, great. I've not had the chance to read that, but the title alone obviously is compelling. We only have 10 minutes, a little less than 10 minutes in this segment. And I wanted to get to this interesting perspective that you have about the global caliphate and how you see apparently Turkey as being the ultimate leader of this. Tell us what's going to happen in your perspective with the growth of Islamist, jihadists, and what they're going to use in order to expand their influence.
Well, we have to understand that the Ottoman Empire fell in the early 1900s, and then Sykes-Picot came, and it divided the Middle East, and that's why you have the nationalistic aspirations in the Middle East, whether it's Ba'ath, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's in Libya. And so the Muslim Brotherhood is a major player in this, which really inculcates itself in the West as well, but it had tremendous impact in Egypt, and after the West with NATO began to dismantle these systems, you had the Muslim Brotherhood victory under Mohammed Morsi, which really catapulted the Muslim Brotherhood outside of Egypt. They're in Turkey. And so the Turkish government under the AK party, or Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he has a aspiration to revive the Ottoman Empire. This is the whole scheme of the Turkish current government. He sees himself as Salim I when he invaded Syria and Egypt and defeated Qanso al-Ghuri in Egypt. And then you had the Battle of Marj Dabiq. Now, if you notice, ISIS's magazine is called what? Dabiq, D-A-B-I-Q. To the Muslim or to the Islamist mindset, Sykes-Picot has to be disbanded, destroyed. And Dabiq is the Armageddon to the Islamic world, as Jerusalem is the Armageddon to the evangelical Christian. So when the U.S. coalition says we're going to fight ISIS in Syria, ISIS loves it because this fulfills their narrative. Of course, Turkey supports ISIS. In fact, right from the beginning, we said Turkey will support ISIS, and we see it already happening. Kerry kind of leaks it and has to apologize to Turkey. And so we have major players in the Middle East. We have the Iranian Revolution, which wants to take its glory into Iraq, into Syria, into Lebanon, and consume much flesh, if you will. Then you have the revival of an Ottoman caliphate. So you have, a Shia revolution and a Sunni revolution. And you have the Muslim Brotherhood, who's the spiritual head, the Egyptian Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who says in August last year that the caliphate of ISIS is not qualified. The major caliphate will come out of Turkey from Istanbul because that's where the last caliphate was. And Erdogan, of course, gives them the voice. He has Rabia television. He makes the media for the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is the part where the U.S. coalition is entering into the fray of the Middle East, not understanding the position of Turkey and the position of Iran. So we're working with Iran right now because we want to fight ISIS. But ISIS is being used as this chip, if you will. Iranians don't care because if ISIS is removed, they control Iraq. The Saudis don't care because ISIS is killing Shia. ISIS is a threat to Saudi Arabia. When it does become a threat, then they will react. But as long as the U.S. coalition is taking care of the matter, they let the Americans take care of it. The biggest problem, of course, was the American misconception about removing dictatorships in the Middle East. That removed with it nationalism. And that began the Turkish model of Islam. So the Turkish model of Islam is a Sufi concept. Oh, the Sufis, they're peaceful Muslims. Hello, they're not. The Ottoman Empire killed more Christians than any other entity on earth. The Sufis, in fact, have a keen understanding with the Shia. They don't have the same Wahhabist concept. Wahhabists destroy museums, they destroy statues, they destroy all kinds of things you see ISIS doing today. But not the Sufis. They have the icons of Hassan and Hussein and Ali, the major icons of the Shia. They are placarded on the Hagia Sophia, the largest church in Christendom. To the Eastern Christians, this is a major issue, Hagia Sophia. To the Western Christians, this is nothing significant, but it is. So we see the war between Islamdom and Christendom in the East, in which Christianity is suffering and struggling tremendously. Turkey is prohibiting even Assyrians to even go into Turkey when they are being bombarded by ISIS currently as we speak.
Right.
So
now, we only have 2 minutes left, and one of the things I wanted to, and this is something that I have trouble really figuring out, is we clearly have a major objective of most that are involved in trying to grow the caliphate toward Islamic control, if you will. I mean, that's a very generic term, but you have even identified the struggle between the Shias out of Iran and the others. I mean, Turkey clearly not in alignment with Iran. How does that conflict work out if Turkey intends to expand the caliphate through its rule?
Well, if you see, when Iran had its nuclear fiasco, Turkey came to the aid of Iran. It has no problems with uniting with Iran. You've seen visits between the two nations in which they could collectively unite. You had Hamas and Hezbollah unite at one time against Israel. So they could use Israel to unite all factions. This is why if you go to the Arab street and you ask, why do you hate ISIS? Because they don't hate Israel. They're killing other Muslims. But Turkey could come in very easily. They're trying to get into Syria right now. And they could say very easily, the problem is Israel, we need to unite. You bet you, the Shia, the Sunni will unite. As Hezbollah and Hamas united and bombarded Israel, if you recall, a few years ago. So it's not unusual for Shia and Sunni to unite, even though they kill each other. It can happen, and it will happen.
Well, it's also interesting that Turkey has kind of grown more distant in its relation with Israel. Of course, conflict relating to the boarding of the ship and everything that happened a few years ago. There's still obviously some
flotilla, yes, absolutely.
Right. Has there been any warming at all between Israel and Turkey over the last several years that you've seen?
It's warming up to be Turkey want to bombard Israel. Look at the Mediterranean situation. Yeah. You look at Greece, Egypt, Israel. It's major issues in the Mediterranean.
Very informative, Walid. How can people get in touch with you or see what you're doing or read your articles, get your book? Do you have a website?
Yes, Shoebat.com, just as you spell the word shoe, S-H-O-E and bat, B-A-T, S-H-O-E-B-A-T.com.
Well, we'll definitely have you back on the show. Your wealth of knowledge, appreciate your perspective. Probably work out here next month to have you on again, maybe for a longer segment, now that I think we've got the phone lines worked out. But I appreciate your insights. Thank you for informing us, my audience, those that are streaming nationwide, about the threat. And thank you for what you're doing.
You bet. God bless America.